So are we ready to get started? Lauren, thumbs up. All right, well, welcome everyone to Surveys, Scotch and Suds. I was told that with this being the era of COVID and it also being the day before Halloween that I ought to be wearing a mask. So given my song selection, I do have a mask. It's Jerry Garcia. So, but that's the only mask I'll have to wear today. It was only 15 months ago that we all convened at the NBOA summer soiree. Many of us who are on this call now had a chance to have a few drinks and network and socialize. And by the way, please read these important rules so that this event today is run smoothly. You know, we all missed the chance to meet personally. It's unbelievable that we've not had the opportunity to get to just be in touch, to talk personally, to brag about our kids, talk about our businesses, just schmooze. This is something that we all miss greatly. And we're lucky that we have this format called Zoom. Today we have an actual important topic to discuss. And this is far from a perfect setting for a Friday afternoon. I'm sure we'd much rather be drinking in person, but let's kick back. If you can have a cocktail or a drink or just anything non-alcoholic, let's relax and enjoy a really good program that we have ahead of us. As we all know, we're going to be discussing a survey, the NBOA's market survey that covers the month of September. I want to thank all the folks who helped put this together. It was a tremendous effort by Alderman Joe Moore, Jay Johnson, Lauren, and folks from the industry, Essex Realty, Doug and Haley, unbelievably supportive and helpful. I also want to thank Lee Kaiser and Daniel Gonzalez of Kaiser Group, who also advised us, and we look forward to working with them in the future, as this has been a selfless effort that we've all put together to put important facts in front of those of us who are housing providers and other people who are interested in following the important events of the day and as it impacts real estate. We have a very important survey. You can see the one question that's here, of course, and it's my great opportunity to introduce a phenomenal moderator, Stacy Young, with Preservation Compact, which is an arm of the Community Investment Corporation. You know, it's from Stacy that I've learned so much about the industry. I've learned what the term NOAA means. NOAA, of course, naturally occurring affordable housing. Through the years that I've known Stacy, I've learned about the efforts to revise the building code. Through Preservation Compact and CIC, they're very important work fleshing out bad and in some instances criminal syndicates that have purchased groups of buildings in the city, and Preservation Compact and CIC have helped undo those bad deals. And Stacy and CIC and Preservation Compact have always been a respected bridge between market rate developers and a range of people throughout the city's affordable housing community searching for solutions. Stacy is always there, and we're just thrilled to have her moderating this webinar. I did talk to Stacy earlier today, and she voiced some concern about moderating, and I said, Stacy, it's a drinking event, so why don't we have a cocktail and it'll settle your nerves. So I'd like to pour one for you, Stacy. So Stacy,
kind introduction. Great.
This one's for you. There you go. Stacy, take it away and cheers.
Thank you. What a kind.
Before Stacy goes on, this is Joe Moore. I know our esteemed president, our esteemed leader, is a very humble man, but he neglected to introduce himself. It's Michael Glasser, president of the Neighborhood Building Owners Alliance.
All right. Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.
And thanks very much. Mike's leadership at the NBOA throughout this crisis has just been phenomenal. I'm not a building owner, but I know from my policy work, as Mike was describing, that through his leadership, these small owners have really gotten their voices on the map, and the city and other policy leaders are really understanding how important these owners are to the industry and really taking this voice into account that I think had been overlooked in the past. So thank you so much. That's a very kind introduction, Mike. And thanks for asking me to moderate. It's truly an honor. So we're already off to a great start. I am anyway. And here's how this happy hour is going to run. We're going to dig into this survey. I know that's why you all came here. We're going to hear some reactions throughout from owners about their experiences compared to what we heard in the survey. And then we're going to dig into some policy implications at the end. And after we talk a little bit about policy, we'll of course leave room for audience Q&A. We've already gotten some, so thanks to those overachievers who have already submitted questions. And then Mike will wrap it up. So let's get started. The survey was administered in late September, so this is very, very recent. Here on the first slide, you can see the next slide here. The NBOA got an amazing response. Surveys came in from throughout the city and the suburbs. You can see from that top chart, all of the geographies that are represented. And then those bottom two donuts, you can see that a big chunk of smaller owners did participate in the survey. Again, this is one of the really unique aspects of NBOA I've heard from throughout the country. So over half of the respondents own fewer than 5 properties, and nearly 40% own fewer than 20 units. And this respondent profile is actually similar to the profile of all residential rental owners across the country. According to a 2015 Harvard study, 3/4, 74% of rental properties are owned by individual investors. And again, that percentage of properties, those that are owned by these individual investors, accounts for nearly half, 46% of all rental units. On the next slide, you can see the types of folks that NBOA heard from. Nearly all were property owners, 92%, 8% were property managers. Collectively, the respondents represented 65,000 units and 5,300 properties. And we're going to dig into, again, just thinking about what those numbers mean as we go through the results here. One quick note about the sizes of the properties. I know I keep coming back to this, but I think this is interesting information. So what those bottom charts are telling us is that the owners who responded own a little bit of everything. Most own just a few buildings of each building size. So each of those charts represents a different building size. Single families, 2 to 4s, 5 to 20s, and 20 pluses. And again, a really tall bar is showing that there's just 1 to 5 buildings of each type owned by the folks who responded to the survey. And now Doug Imber, again, I know Mike just talked about his commitment to this, but truly from this experience, just over the past few days getting involved in this, truly has committed a ton of time and effort to this, co-founder of Essex Realty. He's going to talk for a few minutes about collections, and then we'll hear from Jay Johnson, president of Cornerstone Investment Group. But Doug and Jay are going to lead you through most of the rest of the survey. And after they present this data, then former Alderman Joe Moore, again, someone else has been committed to the community for decades, is going to talk about policy implications, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Again, that's how we're going to run this today. So I'll hand it off to Doug and Jay to take you through some more details about collections, COVID impacts, late payments, and vacancies. Doug, do you want to take it away on this next slide?
You bet. Thanks, Stacy. And I appreciate the NBOA having me on the panel. And there are a few points I'd like to highlight about collections on this slide. First and foremost, more than half of the respondents reported collecting 95% or less of their September rent. And second, 29% of the respondents reported collecting 85% or less of September rents. Essex performed a similar survey back in April of 35,000 apartment units. And at that time, 24% of the respondents reported collecting 85% or less. This number's now increased from 24% to 29% in just a few months. And it shows a pretty bad trend. To give some context to this, Essex looks at literally hundreds of property financial statements every year. And I can tell you that typically housing providers' margins are in the 5 to 10% range. Occasionally, if an investor has no or low debt, that number might be higher. But I'll tell you, with 15% vacancy rates, this survey suggests that about a third of housing providers are likely losing money each month. And as Stacy mentioned, please keep in mind that 69% of the respondents to this survey own less than 100 units. These aren't large institutional investors. These are small businesses. And I think this is sobering as well. If you take a closer look at the smaller housing providers who responded to this survey, that is people who own less than 50 units in total, they reported that 22% of them collected less than 76% of their September rent. And to put that in perspective, that represents about 1,000 housing units of small investors running 25% or greater vacancy just in this survey. And it begs the question, how many of us are likely to end up in a foreclosure or financial distress situation? And similarly, the chart at the bottom of this page shows that about a third of renters had partial or no September, had paid partial or no September rent. And I want to point out that what this survey doesn't reflect is the fact that there's been an incredible increase in the use of concessions and a substantial lowering of rents that has occurred across almost every market. So even in buildings that we surveyed that are experiencing high physical vacancy, high physical occupancy, or have reported fewer collection issues, their overall income is down almost universally. And so that's really why we decided to combine this presentation with cocktails. We would figure that everybody would need a drink after hearing those sobering statistics. So thanks, Stacy.
Yeah, no, thank you. A great presentation of a lot of information. And now I'm going to introduce Rafael Leon. Rafael directs the Chicago Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, fondly known as CMHDC. Rafael, under his leadership, CMHDC is one of those very rare nonprofits that acts like a for-profit. They're very efficient in their operations. Less than 25% of their units have subsidies, and they own a lot of different types of buildings, 2 flats on up to 50 unit buildings. And they're also super geographically diverse. They have buildings on the north side, south side, and even a little bit out west. And so my question to you, Rafael, are you seeing these numbers play out in your portfolio? What's your experience?
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. Yes, definitely. These numbers coincide with what we have seen. Last year, on a typical month before COVID-19, we were collecting somewhere between 90 and 95% of the rents. The rents that we didn't collect in any month, we carry over for the following month, but we eventually collected those rents. Since March, and that's when we started keeping track of what will happen in the following month, because I was following what's happening in China and Europe. And when they started shutting down countries in Europe, I took the initiative to start thinking, well, this is going to happen here eventually. So we took March as the base month to see how we were doing. And I could tell you that in March, and I'm looking at my numbers here, we didn't collect $90,500. That number in April went up to 112,000. In May, it went to 118,000. Then something happens. I think that the federal government started providing the $600 a month unemployment addition, and people started paying the rents. So in June, from 118, we went to 90,000. In July, we went to 68,000. In August, 65,000. But in September, it went up to $90,000 again. And I think that's a reflection that people are not getting additional unemployment compensation, and they have to set priorities for where they're going to spend the money that they have. But the numbers reflected in this analysis pretty much what's happening to us. And as you said, Stacy, we have units that are buildings that are small as 2 units, and our largest building is 52 units. We're on the south side, we're on the north side, we're on the west side, we're in the suburbs. So we're all over. So everybody's being affected by this. And the thing that is uncertain and different from the past is that in the past, we knew that eventually we will collect that money. Now we don't know whether we will collect that money because people may leave. Some people have decided not to pay rent because of the moratorium on evictions. Not a lot of people are taking advantage of that. A lot of people are paying their rents. But my guess is that comes the beginning of the year, those people who are $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 behind, they may say, I'm moving and we're not paying you anything. So that's money that we will never recoup. So that's the big difference. In the past, we always counted that we were going to recoup that money eventually, whether it's 1 month or 2 months later. Now it's very uncertain whether we'll recoup that money. We're waiting actually for IDA to see how many tenants will be subsidized. I know that out of almost 700 units, I think that 35 families qualify for the IDA. They submitted applications for the IDA subsidy. Only 19 were determined that they will qualify, and we're waiting to see if those 19 will get subsidies from IDA.
That's really, really helpful context, Rafael. I really like how you put together your timeline of sort of what's been happening in the properties, and definitely dovetails with some of the policy discussions we're going to have in a few minutes in terms of what happened with that unemployment expansion, asking questions about the rent relief, and thinking through the moratorium and the impacts of that. So thank you very much. Really, really great context. And now we're going to hear more about collections really broken out by geography. And Jay Johnson is going to lead us through this part of the discussion. Again, Jay, heading up Cornerstone Investment Group. And again, super active leader in the community, and always nice to work with Jay.
Thanks, Stacey, for those nice, kind words. So I'm going to go through 2 different charts, and Lauren, if you can back up one chart to the north side, back up. So anyway, so we're going to go the same charts that Doug just went through, but we're going to break it down by north and south side. First, looking at the north side, and then we'll look at some more detail regarding the north side. So what we see here is that, again, 49% of the respondents collected less than 95% of the rent on the north side, which includes north suburbs and northwest side of the city. Importantly, is this 21% collected less than 85% of their rent roll, and those are staggeringly bad numbers. And we broke it down a little bit further by taking just look at city properties, and this is kind of interesting, I think, is city properties on the north side only, they collected 91% of them collected 86 or better % of their September rent roll. The northwest side of the city only 59% of them collected 86% of their rent roll, and in the city downtown area was 75%. I was surprised at the really different levels that we saw even on the north and northwest side. But it's indicative of where the city is. The city has a lot of different neighborhoods, and every neighborhood has different challenges and opportunities. And this is even on the north side highlights what we're dealing with. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the two donuts below because really Doug already went through those, and this north side kind of replicates what was happening in total. Let's go to the south side, which and this will again represent south side city, west side of the city, and west and south suburbs. We see that a pretty dramatic change. Only 66% of the respondents, or 66% of the respondents, did not collect 95% of their rent, and the numbers at the 75, 85 and below, that bumped up to 42% of all respondents. That's, it's a pretty staggering number. And if you looked at versus the north side, that was a 42 versus a 21%, almost a doubling in that what I'll call the really fragile property owners that are certainly probably putting money into their properties every month to keep them going. But I will spend a little bit of time on the donuts down here on the south side, on the prepaid or paid partial rent or no rent. So the two donuts, there's one on the left is, paid partial rent. And if you look at this, the red, blue, and the kind of gold portions of that, 33% of respondents indicated that their tenants paid only partial September rent. Going to the other side, paid no rent, that was 26% of the respondents indicated that. Those are, you're not cash flowing your building. You're not being able to have enough money to put into your building to be able to put, in most situations, to keep it afloat, and it puts a lot of property at risk. Doug mentioned that on the smaller household property owners, there's about 1,000 units that are at risk. If we take a look at in total, there's about 5,400, 5,300 properties in this study, and if we look at the percentage of people that are below 86% in rent, that represents about 1,200 properties. And those are properties that are significantly at risk of having some type of significant financial situation, maybe foreclosure. And I think we're gonna have somebody else talk a little bit about their experience on the south side, and we'll get a little bit more kind of granular on that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. The contrast is stunning. It's really helpful to look at those geographic differences. So, right, now we're going to hear from Steve Rich. He owns about 100 units on the south side. He's a firefighter in addition to owning these buildings. And again, I mean, I would ask you, Steve, do these south side numbers in particular, maybe the ones on the next slide, do those represent what you're seeing in your portfolio? You may have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I think that it's very similar. It sounds like listening to the previous participants, Raphael in particular, where he said about 90 to 95% pre-COVID is where we were with collections on our portfolio. And to date, I think that we've seen like a slight dip in some of the properties, maybe to 90 to 85% collections. But I also would be interested to see, now I don't know how this breaks out, but the subsidies, the amount of subsidies to market rate tenants, and see like if these respondents are all market rate, or if they have a mix of subsidies, because I think that does, my portfolio, I generally like to have a
Oh no, Steve was just getting to the good part. I can't believe it. I was on the edge of my seat. Steve, you froze up. Lauren, what can we do? I can't believe this. I want to hear that number. Oh, here we go. Steve?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You cut out right when you were talking about your portfolio and how important you thought that having information about subsidy might be because your portfolio something.
Yeah, I was just saying that my portfolio pre-COVID was about 30 to 40% subsidies, and post-COVID, we've changed that to about 40 to 60% to make sure that we can, retain a little bit more of the expenses of running the business and maybe capture a little bit more profit. But I think that we did, similar to what Raphael says, we did see an uptick in collections when the government was giving some assistance and things like that. It has taken a while for this to kind of filter down to multifamily real estate. So I would be interested to see what these next coming months are. But in this last 6 months, I would say that things have kind of held steady. And with the assistance that's been given to this point, we have been okay. Now, if this lingers on, or if there's a second or third occurrence of lockdowns and shutdowns, then I definitely would be worried to see what the figures look like and real world looks like after that.
Thanks so much. Again, really helpful context. And to talk for a minute about late payments, Doug?
Yeah, if we want to go, Lauren, to the next slide regarding the COVID effect. And I just have one comment I'd like to make on this slide and amplify that approximately 60% of the respondents said they have residents who have reported COVID-19 related hardships as the reason they're unable to pay rent. And I know this isn't new news, but it's clear that the effects of COVID are deep and wide. And if you would please go to the next slide about late rental payments. In a similar way, 44% of the respondents said they have residents who are more than 180 days in arrears with their rent payment. On the south side, it's worse. It's 48% of respondents said they have residents who are more than 180 days in arrears. The north side is slightly better at 38%. But I'd like to add that I personally know so many of Chicago's housing providers, and I know how much compassion they've shown to their residents as we've all gone through this difficult time. And obviously no one wants to see evictions occur now, but the eviction moratorium places a uniquely unfair burden on housing providers. Why aren't grocery stores, clothing stores, utility companies, or pharmacies required to provide free goods and services like housing providers? There's no moratorium that I've heard for charging for food, clothing, heat, and drugs.
Why aren't grocery stores and others required to provide free goods and services in the same manner as the housing?
I'm not sure what just happened there, but I'll just finish up this thought that those services are no less critical than housing, yet our industry as housing providers is being required to shoulder an incredibly unfair burden. And society rightfully does not want a homeless problem, but I don't think that responsibility should be shouldered. I think it should be shouldered collectively by society, not merely by the housing providers. And I think one of the things about these survey results that I want to point out is it clearly demonstrates that this is not sustainable. Having housing providers shoulder this burden uniquely through this eviction moratorium is just not a sustainable solution. Thanks, Stacy.
Yeah, and again, I think, Mr. McGinnis perhaps was asking this question that you just answered, and I'm hoping that we'll get into some of this in the policy discussion after we walk through these survey results, which is, how what are the things that we can advocate for so that indeed society does shoulder this burden instead of the owners themselves. So thank you for that, Doug. And on the next slide, I think we're looking at some late rental payments that are split out a little bit by geography. I'm right about that, right? Yeah. And so again, this is showing, again, this is how difficult, how many owners are having to put up with very long, large arrearages here on the late rental payments, this other slide. And I'm going to turn to Steve Thomas. Steve is an owner on the South Side. He's the head of 5T Management. He owns 340 units and has 800 more under third-party management. And so, you know, again, Steve, I'll ask the same question that I asked the other owners. Do these numbers about late payments reflect what you're seeing in your portfolio?
They do, and good afternoon, everyone. They do, and what's interesting though is even on the South Side, you still have to drill down because we're finding in different areas of the South Side that some of these are holding true, but in other areas they're not. The portfolios that we have in Beverly, strong. I mean, really haven't skipped a beat because again, most of those tenants have jobs that they are allowed to work from home. They're not necessarily considered essential where they might have had hours cut versus in some of our other areas, South Shore. We have people who work at the airlines who've been laid off from this, people who worked again in other jobs where hours have been cut, hotels, things of that nature. And so even on the South Side, it is definitely just a function of when you start dividing up and really parsing down and looking at your tenant base to see what type of job they have, these numbers are definitely on point, but again, in some areas they're not. And the slow pays that we're seeing in certain areas, we're starting to extrapolate out to see that, if you go for 6 months at the rate of the slow pays that are happening, that all of a sudden now we're going to get to a full month behind. So in 8 months, you'll be 2 months behind and things of that nature. So it's very interesting just parsing the data at individual buildings in different parts of the South Side, and also just looking at how certain owners may have had tenants that they qualify with 2.5 times rent versus others that said, hey, I want someone who does 3.5 times rent. So it's very interesting looking at the data.
Thanks. And I also think I should have said this before, and I think this has been well documented, which is that the neighborhoods hit the hardest by COVID in terms of job loss and just COVID illness. Those neighborhoods are mostly on the south and the west sides of the city. And so, again, a lot of the renters in those areas had problems paying the rent before this happened. And, this crisis has really hit them hard. So thank you, Steve. Very, very, again, helpful context. And we have another slide here that, Doug, will you take us through this next one?
Actually, I'm going to let Jay.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Okay.
Jay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all good. So Steve, that's really it's interesting data to hear, and it really highlights how the most vulnerable have been impacted the most by COVID and by the shutdown, and not only from a tenant base, but I think also from a small landlord perspective. I'll spend a couple seconds just on the rental climate and looking at occupancy. I mean, we've already seen a lot of really kind of devastating data for the industry, but this chart just highlights 21% of respondents indicated they have 11% or more vacant units right now. This is not the whole story either, but it highlights there's another problem. There, not only do we have rent collection issues, but we have vacancy problems. And I can speak from personal experience on that the vacancy rates are higher in our larger units where we used to have people have roommates. Now they're less likely to have roommates, and we've had to offer more concessions and more reduce our rent in those units more than we had expected to at any point in time. So I think this is only the tipping point here that, you know, vacancy is going to continue to maybe creep up, but our rent roll is going to, expected rent roll collected is going to decline based on other concessions. And I'll just start talking a little bit about the next slide, a little bit about IDA program. If you look there, about 55% of the respondents of the housing providers indicated that they have tenants who applied for housing assistance, and just highlights the huge need for the federal, state, and local government to help out these tenants who are unable to pay their rent, and to basically provide a lifeline to a lot of small property owners, housing providers, in order for them to save their buildings. Otherwise, if they don't, we're going to have a bigger crisis down the road over the next few months and years with a lot of foreclosures. So we need help from our policymakers to help us get through this.
That's great context again, Jay. Doug, were you going to say something? Okay. I was just going to say, you know, as a transition into the policy discussion, the IDA relief, this was the largest, the rent relief provided by IDA was the biggest program in the country. So it was $150 million, and IDA gave, and each state or locality that develops this rental assistance, they can set it up however they like. IDA is giving $5,000 to each eligible and selected recipient of the assistance. And so that 150 million, it sounds like a lot, it's only going to serve 30,000 households. And in the scheme of things, you know, it's not that much, especially compared to the need. So with that, and also just, again, we can talk for a minute about what's happening with that IDA money, because I think owners, you know, again, anecdotally have been saying different things, that some are getting notes from IDA saying that some tenants have been selected and that they'll see some money soon. Other owners have just gotten checks and they're not sure even who the tenants were that were selected. So just, again, for your information, one thing that IDA has said is that they expect the notifications of those tenant approvals to go out by November 10th. And then the grant payout, if you get that notification that your tenants, some of your tenants were selected, the grant payment would come a few days later. So just some context in case some of you had questions about that. But again, as Jay said, this is a great transition into policy implications. You know, rent relief is really important. We know it's not perfect. That unemployment, that expanded unemployment, several of the panelists and owners mentioned that. So I'll turn it over to Joe Moore to talk more about what those policy implications are and what we think the implications of this survey will be on NBOA's advocacy efforts.
Thank you, Stacy. Once again, I'm Joe Moore. I serve as NBOA's lobbyist, primarily in the city council, although I would do some work as well with the county and the state of Illinois. And working in tandem with our media consultants, Sphere, we have been telling both the public at large and our policymakers that the housing industry right now is very fragile. And this study has provided something additional to the anecdotal stories that we were telling in the past. And that is hard evidence that, in fact, the housing industry right now and housing in our neighborhoods is extremely fragile, particularly when you're talking about the small and mid-sized property owners. They're the ones that literally, they don't have any cash reserves. The money they take in goes immediately back out to maintain their buildings and to pay their bills. And so that's the message that we have been trying to get to our policymakers. Doug made a very good point. There's been a lot of people agitating, activists saying, calling for a rent holiday or for a forgiveness of rent. And no other industry that I know of where those kind of demands are being made. As Doug noted, you don't ask grocery store owners to give needy people free food. You don't ask pharmacies to give people in need free medicine. And yet our industry is the industry that's being asked to give away our product for free, not acknowledging that just like grocery stores and just like pharmacies, we require on people purchasing our products, in this case housing, in order to maintain our business and provide people with the kind of housing that they're entitled to live in. And so just as people who need food go to the government and get assistance through food stamps and vouchers, and people who need medicine and can't afford it rely on Medicaid and Medicare, we need to rely on our federal government in particular, since they're really the only governmental entity at this time that can afford to do that, is to provide meaningful relief in terms of rental relief, in terms of extended unemployment benefits, in terms of returning to the $600 additional unemployment payments that provided people with a lifeline and gave housing providers the income that they need in order to keep their heads above water. We heard from Raphael and Steve that those federal dollars helped their bottom line. When unemployment kicked in and when the $600 unemployment enhancement kicked in, they saw their rent rolls, their rent payments go up. And when those benefits disappeared and ran out, not surprisingly, the housing providers were hurting as well. And so the first thing that we have been working on is advocating for our federal elected officials to push Congress to enact another round of federal stimulus that includes rent relief, that includes unemployment benefits, that includes the things that help to keep our economy going during this very serious time. Because this economic downturn was fully a creation of the pandemic and the government response ordering the shutdown of our economy. And so government has a responsibility to the citizens, to the residents in this country, to provide the relief necessary to keep everything going until we can get through this pandemic. The other thing we want to point out, and these are arguments we've been making to our local elected officials, our aldermen, our mayor, our county officials, is that this is the worst possible time to be talking about putting into place additional regulations and restrictions. All of you who have been paying attention to the news have known that within the last year and a half, there's been really a political sea change, particularly in the city of Chicago, but also in county government, where all of a sudden, all these additional requirements, restrictions, regulations are being proposed and some being enacted against the housing industry. And if Lauren, if you could put up the slide just to give people an indication. As you can see, there have been, since 2019, since the new city council took over, there's been an increasing number of proposals that are being placed entirely on the housing industry. From the fair notice ordinance that requires additional notice given to tenants before we determine whether to renew their lease, to the just cause ordinance, which essentially would prohibit housing providers from not renewing a lease unless there is a grounds tantamount to a grounds for eviction, such as non-payment of rent, to not renew this lease. In other words, to give people a right in perpetuity to remain in their unit as long as they abide by the terms of the existing lease and pay the rent on time. These are the kind, and of course, in Springfield, there's already a lot of agitation and talk of renewing the proposal for rent control in Springfield during the veto session coming up next month. This information that we got today puts meat on the bones of our assertion that our industry is struggling, that our industry is fragile, and that putting more additional burdens, particularly at this time, particularly during this economic crisis, particularly during the pandemic, is not only not going to help tenants, but will severely harm the industry that keeps those tenants housed. And so with your support of this organization, we can take that message to our elected officials, make sure that that this legislation is at least put on the back burner until we figure out where the industry is after we get through this economic crisis.
Thanks. Really, really great overview of what's happening. And again, I think, as you said at the beginning, this is a really great presentation of data that can help make this case about how vulnerable and fragile these small business owners are. And they are small business owners. And if people purport to care about these business owners, they need to support them. So I am just going to quickly go over a couple of these IDA questions in the chat. You know, I do think I have heard some other owners talk about a decline in collections after the IDA program rolled out, as if they didn't have to pay rent now that there was IDA relief available. I think that speaks to the efficiency of unemployment assistance, as Joe Moore was just talking about. If the federal relief is going to come, and we can all get behind that, the expanded unemployment assistance clearly helped the owners who are talking on this call. IDA says they hope to have in the next couple of weeks notices out to folks, and that the checks will follow after that. I do want to talk for a minute about one of the questions we got in advance, and this is a question about the moratorium, or I'm sorry, about the 5-day notices. And how can we continue? This is from Mr. Dominic Ricordino. How can we continue to do business when government sides with non-paying tenants? And he's also concerned about increased property taxes and water taxes. So I'm not sure if someone wants to take this on. You know, if any of you want to prognosticate on that question about the 5, 10, and 30-day notices.
Well, the main issue is 5-day notices. The courts are entertaining 10-day eviction notices for material non-compliance in cases of emergency and safety of people. The concern about the moratoria, and you know, we all understand it, and it's a very troubling issue that we're struggling with. We look at the governor's moratoria and we look at the CDC guidelines, and we in our industry have our opinions about which rules would be more favorable and more appropriate. And we're lobbying and working and along with our industry coalition partners, lobbying the governor to consider ways of making the moratorium more better reflect the equities and what's appropriate at this time. It's very frustrating to see situations where there's tenants who might be able to afford the rent but don't. We're mindful of those situations, yet we also are sympathetic to and understand the needs of those who are truly impacted by COVID that need a roof over their head. So it's a challenge for everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Go ahead.
Stacey, if
Yeah.
I could follow up on what Joe Moore said about at the very beginning regarding organized groups to stop rents, to have a rent moratorium. It is true at the very beginning, in March, April, we encounter a couple of groups that were encouraging people not to pay rent. So what we did is that we instructed our management companies to send letters to all the tenants, whether they were late or no, it didn't matter. But what we told them was that if they didn't have the capacity to pay the rent, that we will work with them to have installment payments, but that they needed to understand that if they didn't pay rent, the tenants, the maintenance people wouldn't get paid.
Mhm.
Therefore, it will affect them, it will affect their family. So there is a domino effect. And as a result, people realize, well, if I don't do my part, then somebody else is going to be affected. So most people who were able to pay the rent, they're paying the rent. There was one building where the tenants tried to form a union to not pay the rent, and we have to negotiate with them. And I said, please don't do that, because you are the one who's going to suffer by not having services provided to this building, and the maintenance people who serve the building are going to suffer. So it's a domino effect, and I think that people were very receptive to that idea that if you are able to pay the rent, pay the rent. If you're unable to pay the rent, then negotiate something with the landlords. Landlords were portrayed at that time as being evil, and that was part of the problem. And we need to resolve that issue. That many people view landlords as being evil, which is not the case.
And I do think, yes, everything you say is true, Raphael. And it's difficult when, as a property owner, you're working with your tenants. And I know that it's frustrating when the tenants aren't responsive. So I think that's a difficult challenge. So I'm going to plunge into something for the bravest of heart, which is how adversely do you think property values will be affected with a Democratic sweep? This is in the chat. If you want to read the rest of this, what would happen if there were a Trump re-election? If Biden wins, should we hold off on selling our buildings because of lower values and higher taxes? Who wants to take that on?
Oh, I guess I'll die on that hill. I think about the 30 years that I've been doing brokerage in Chicago. And I think about the fact that we've had Gulf War, the second Gulf War, terrorist attacks. We've had changes in tax policy. We've had tax reassessments, multiple elections, recessions, great recessions, and yet property values have slugged forward. I don't think higher property taxes, which I believe are going to be not just an issue in Chicago and Cook County, but really nationwide to help pay for the economic dislocation from COVID. I think it's going to be a national issue. But sadly, I think one of the consequences of COVID is that the accessibility to home ownership might be harder to achieve. And so I think you may see folks staying renters longer. And thankfully for our part of the industry, interest rates and the accessibility of debt for multifamily has remained really strong during the COVID crisis. And that's really buoyed property values. So do I think that higher taxes and certain policies can have an adverse effect? I do, but I think take it in the long term, I'm confident that Chicago's market will figure out a way to navigate this and the problems that we're talking about today.
And a follow-up is the real question: how do we get the political will to do something? you know, it feels like there isn't one now. And maybe this is a policy follow-up question on the federal relief, well, or on the local regulations.
Well, I guess that's me. I'm the policy guy, and most of you who know of me in my previous life, as I was I'm a Democrat. So obviously, I approach it from that perspective. But I would say that if you're concerned about keeping your property taxes manageable and keeping city fees and other assessments low, we've got to get some help from the federal government. We've got to, the cities and the states cannot bear this burden on their own. They simply don't have the revenue. There's only one governmental entity that can print money and that has the resources that can help not only Chicago, but cities and towns across America get through this pandemic and not lay off people and increase regressive fees and taxes. And that's the federal government. And so, my hope is that once we get past this election, hopefully it won't drag on for weeks and weeks through the legal disputes, and that we can start moving on. And my hope is we'll have a Congress that understands the need to provide support, not only to individuals, not only to renters, not only housing providers, but state and local governments, so they can provide the services that people need and want without undue local tax burdens.
Yeah, and I think it begs the question because clearly at some point there will be relief. I think the question from our industry is and one of the survey questions asked, would we prefer direct assistance to landlords or housing providers or directly to the tenants? I think we need to look very carefully at our experiences and in many instances frustrations and the complications. Despite their best efforts, I think IDA had a challenge on their hand to document and process $150 million. It took a couple months to do it, and there were very good and competent people working on that. It's a tough process. I will almost submit that the enhanced unemployment and putting revenue into tenants' hands is probably the most efficient way to bring income, which is really lacking here, income into the economy and into the landlord-tenant dynamic, and it certainly seemed to have worked pretty well until July 31st.
And I mean, I will be interested actually in getting those poll results. So, mostly I'm just interested in who's drinking Scotch versus beer. I mean, that's generally how I'm thinking about things. But thank you, Joe. But there was that other question. So if we can get those, that's just sort of a fun curiosity. But I'd like to just address this last question that's in the chat. If you have questions, feel free. Otherwise, I think we're probably going to wrap up here. This last question says, is there a stay on holdovers? We should be able to get our apartments back at the end of the lease term.
There's no relief for holdover tenants from the best of my knowledge. The moratorium applies to everybody except those who might be creating a situation where there's an element of danger.
And Stacy, I just want to throw in, us as landlords, the mindset is going to have to turn the corner sooner than later for us. If you look at the amount of people and just the noise about evictions in Chicago, if all those people are truly evicted, who are you going to rent to? The reality is that this pandemic has brought something that, at least in my 55 years of being on the earth, I've never encountered. And at this point, there needs to be empathy. As Raphael said, those that can pay, please pay. Those that can't, as a landlord, and if I know that you lost your job, I really can't, I can't get blood out of a turnip. If you're taking care of my place, I almost prefer you to be there because I don't have to worry about somebody breaking in potentially. I know you're taking care of it. And eventually, as landlords, we're going to have to potentially change the way that we have vetted tenants and become more granular because, there are some that don't take people with evictions. There are some that don't. But after this, you're going to have to really dig down and look at your tenant who's applying to you, because someone who had paid rent and had no issues prior to COVID, and COVID is the reason why they have an eviction, it's going to be a mind shift for a lot of landlords that, if you get out of the noise and just think logically, you're going to have to turn that corner.
I think that's an interesting perspective. There was a North Side building owners call a couple of weeks ago, and some of those owners had really interesting perspectives on how COVID had changed the way they thought about their properties and their tenants. And I think that's it's definitely one way to look at this crisis. So there's a question, and then there's a flip side comment in the chat, which is the answer is not cutting taxes, and more government assistance, the greater possibility of some not wanting to return to work. That's also a perspective. And there's a question here on a chance for tax bill reduction based on occupancy, not payment for landlord, for housing providers. And please put yourself on mute if you're not. So I think the question is, this will be our last question. There is a bill in Springfield that is a property tax incentive. It hasn't passed, but it's a property tax incentive for owners who invest in their properties. I think this is an interesting idea. And again, sort of, I think on the federal level, some people have thought about this as sort of that PPP, payment protection, paycheck protection program that would sort of apply to landlords and say, look, if you've lost rent in this crisis period, can you get a tax bill reduction to offset those losses? I think it's an interesting idea. I don't know if any panelists have thoughts on that.
Well, I just wanted to say one of the things that we're talking about in the realm of affordable housing. Many folks might know that the city's currently re-examining the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which requires any new developments to set aside a certain percentage of the units in the new development to people who are poor or are working class. And the challenge you get with that, of course, is that it's essentially acts as a tax and a disincentive. And at a time where the city is in very dire financial straits, we can't tax or cut our way out of these budget deficits. The way we do it is to grow our economy. And the last thing you want to do is discourage investment in one of the biggest growth sectors in the economy, which has been the residential real estate market. So instead of just simply having bludgeons against the industry, perhaps we should try the carrot approach too, in providing incentives through density bonuses, tax breaks for those who do create more affordable housing. It's, I think, a much more efficient way economically of bringing more affordable housing on the market. And at the same time, it doesn't discourage the overall development of housing, which is not only good for the city's economy, but the more housing you create, it goes to follow that the more affordable housing you will have through the law of supply and demand.
And let's not forget, Stacy, the legislation that is pending but seems stalled for accessory dwelling units. It's, to us, the lowest of low-hanging options that If it was left up to the private market and the opportunities for folks to add basement units into their 4-flat or 6-flat or 20-unit building, they could add tens of thousands of new units, many of them affordable, many of them accessible. And that's one of the positive policy options out there that could help address this problem without costing a lot, adding revenue to the city.
It's a great point, an easy way to put more units on the market without government assistance. I think that's another really good point. And we don't want to keep you guys much longer. I know there's a lot more in the chat, and there were some other questions about, you know, property taxes and concerns about property taxes going up. I don't know if any panelists want to take that on.
Stacey, I'm not going to answer any questions, but I'm going to make a comment because as a nonprofit housing developer and property owner, we provide affordable housing. And I think that we operate completely different from what the majority of the people participating in this discussion operate. But one of the lessons that we should take from this experience is that during the good times, create reserves. Because we are a nonprofit, we never took money out of the corporation. That money remained on the books of CMHTC. We had the money to create big reserves. Are we affecting today? Yes. Can we weather the situation? Yes. And that's in part because we created big reserves. And that's the lesson I think that people should take to heart. During the good times, nobody expected this, but when you are doing well, create reserves because you never know what's coming your way.
That's true. And one of the challenges for these small business owners, of course, as you know, it's lean, it's as I think everyone here has said, it's a, fragile, the businesses are quite fragile. So, well, I'm going to thank everybody for these great, these great questions and great responses. And I'm going to hand it over to Mike to wrap this up. Does that make sense, Mike? Are you ready?
Sure, let's go. We have 5 more minutes here. But this is my opportunity to share with you more about the NBOA. Many times people ask me, hey, I want to join the NBOA. How do I do it? And the NBOA was formed probably nearly 20 years ago as an advocacy arm for many of the neighborhood building owner groups that had sprouted up throughout Chicago. Presently, there's 8 neighborhood building owner organizations. You can see them on the screen that comprise of the NBOA, and there's representatives from each of these organizations. So if you're interested in advocacy, if you're interested in networking, if you want to just be involved, the easiest pathway is to join one of these or more than one of these organizations. Of course, I'm partial to the Rogers Park Builders Group, but and I think not everyone, but most of the organizations welcome and encourage even the smaller owners to come, or some of the larger people. But what we have in common is that we represent the neighborhoods. And it's the voice of the neighborhood owner, which has been so important. And at least, and I can personally attest, I've been president of the NBOA for 3 years. And we have tremendous relationships with the CAA, which is the Chicagoland Apartment Association, and CAR, who represent the industry as well. What we've been able to bring to the table is the views of the neighborhoods. And especially since COVID started, I have met some exceptional people from throughout the city who own 4 flats or 2 flats, even a condo unit. And these are the people, regretfully, who are most impacted by the moratoria or other policies. But these are people that really provide the naturally occurring affordable housing throughout the city. And it's exciting for me to be working with some excellent people on our board to give these folks a voice and to be able to advocate on their behalf. Not just the small people, but we represent the 20-unit building owners, the 40 units, even larger. Now, before COVID, we were pretty busy. We didn't have much of a paid staff. We didn't really need one, but we dealt with rent control, and we worked with our industry partners, and we successfully advocated against rent control in 2019. Then last summer, I had a real awakening when I found myself, and our organization found itself again working with our industry partners on, remember this, guys, the Just Housing Amendment, the county ordinance that restricted our ability to screen criminal backgrounds. And that was a real awakening. And we had some progress, and we had some setbacks. And we thought that was a major change in the way we go about doing our credit checks. And yet we understood the intention of the policy. There were certainly unintended consequences that caused us to question whether the reality, whether the benefit was going to really be there. Then last fall, we started meeting with the city. And of course, underlying all this, we had discussions and developed a relationship with the assessor, who was changing the way he was doing the assessment process with a focus on transparency and predictability. But also we saw a changing in the way that the apartment industry was being burdened with higher assessments. But then we met with the city, and we had meetings where the city wanted to offer a series of tenant protection ordinances, a plan in Woodlawn that would offer tenants a right of first refusal if you wanted to sell your house, the just cause eviction ordinance, which would have entailed relocation fees. It seemed like a lot. And then COVID struck. And Lauren, can you go to the next slide, please? We brought on a couple of professionals, and we, the first weekend of COVID, we had a Zoom meeting. A lot of us figured out how to use Zoom. I made good friends that evening with this guy, the bottle of Scotch, and we realized we had a new situation in our hands. And we did what an astute, smart organization would do. We brought on professionals. We brought on Alderman Moore, who has just done an exceptional job for our industry. He's absolutely been his experience in the city council and his knowledge of the political landscape has been an incredible boon for our industry. We owe him a debt of gratitude, and he's jumped at the opportunity and done a phenomenal job, and still does a great job. Also, we brought on a PR team, Sphere Communications. I think Clint Sabin is on the phone. If you folks can do it, I urge you to look at the slide. It would take me a long time to recite all of the different media placements that we've had, but we've been in Forbes, we've been in the Tribune, we've been in Cranes, we've been in the Sun-Times, on the radio, WGW, the radio, WLS radio, VON radio. Just this week, we had a piece about the survey on WBEZ. Go to the website and look at the list and the quality of the pieces where we have been advocating and telling the story that we are not the devil, but we are a necessary component to a stable and healthy real estate environment. So the story, the media placements speak for themselves. I really encourage you to go on there. And by the way, when you're on the website, you'll find that list that Joe had shown of all the legislation that we've been facing. That's on the website. You'll also see a sheet that we prepared for us to show to our tenants. Why is rent important? Many of the things that Raphael had explained to his residents, we also placed on this flyer. We're going to be circulating another flyer. So please go to the website and check this out. Now, please go to the next slide, Lauren. Since COVID, we've dealt with the NBOA, and again, with industry, our partners, with this issue of the moratoria. We've established relationships and are interacting with the sheriff, police, and the courts. What's going to happen when the moratorium is lifted, and how prepared are these? And we have relationships with them. A new issue that we're also looking with is the RTLO, which is an initiative to bring the RLTO to the county, Cook County, the rest of Cook County. You'll hear more about that later. Since COVID, we've dealt with what's called the Fair Notice Ordinance. By the way, today's October 30th. if you have tenants who've been with you for 3 years or more, whose leases are up February 28th, you got to give them notice by tomorrow of your intention to raise rent or non-renew them for February 28th tenants for next year, or if they've been there from 6 months to 3 years, any December 31st tenants. This is a new ordinance that we have to deal with, along with the other ordinances that we've had a role in impacting the eviction protection ordinance, like the ADU stuff. Next slide, please. So what do we have going on in the future? Well, we know there's going to be continued issues pertaining to the moratorium. And that goes without saying. And of course, the issue, once the governor lifts the moratorium, how will the courts and the sheriff handle the backlog? We're glad that we've established some relationships here, and the sheriff actually this week suggested that we join them on a task force to look into these issues. We will have to deal at the state level, again, with our industry partners who are very well organized on this, with the rent control issue. There's talk with all these COVID evictions that are out there. There's talk about ceiling of evictions. That would be a state legislation, I believe. It might be a county or city, but I think that would really be heard in the state level. And at the city level, that last word should be ordinance, not act. Joe mentioned the ARO, which is more of a development issue. Lauren, I'm not sure if I have another slide or not. Is there anything else after this? Oh, there you go. Yeah, this is the most important slide. I'm asking all of you to understand that in order for us to continue with our paid professionals, and you know, the board is all volunteer. My time is volunteer. Jay and Doug's time volunteer. But in order for us to be as impactful as we've been and to continue to be impactful, we do need to pay our bills. You all know how that nobody can fight these battles alone. This is a collective opportunity we have. Again, there's several different organizations out there, and there's all of our affiliates, and there's us. I urge and implore you all who understand what we're doing, who value the need for you to have advocates, to join the affiliates. If you want to be involved at the board level, reach out to me. We need advocates, and we also need the resources to allow these professionals to do their exceptional work. And there's an opportunity to donate at our website. If you're wondering how much to give, my rule of thumb is don't think about your studio apartments, but think about maybe your 2 or 3 bedroom higher end apartment, and think about 1 month's rent from a higher end apartment. And think about if our efforts might save you at least 1 month's rent for one apartment. And please contribute and help us. We really need to raise some money to keep our efforts afloat, at least through the spring of next year. With that being said, I want to also reiterate that another thing that you all can do is to be mindful of these kind of surveys. There will be more. I don't think we're going to do it monthly, but in 2 or 3 months from now, please remember how important it is that we have a strong participation rate. And please participate in the survey, encourage others, because with the numbers that we're showing, we're able to provide substance beyond all the anecdotal evidence. It's the hardcore numbers that mean something. Luckily, the NBOA has achieved a level of credibility. The CAA does the same. And with the credibility and the recognition by elected officials that our views are important, we can impact what's happening at the various levels of government. So with that being said, for any of you guys that have a glass or a bottle, I'm going to choose a bottle. Stacy, I'm not going to pour for you. A toast to better days ahead, to us all working together to show empathy and compassion to those who are in need during this holiday season, and to work together, and we'll get through this and be better off as a result. Happy holidays.
Thanks, Michael. Cheers.